welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Angel Laureano. I can't wait to tell you about the really interesting way in which I met him, but he is a power systems senior platform engineer at Cummins Incorporation. How are you doing today?
I am doing good. How about yourself?
I'm good. I have to first say the story of how we met. So we were
Yeah.
in Puerto Rico. You had also come back for a week, and
Yeah.
we both had gone to the El Yunque National Forest very coincidentally at the same time, and we were swimming in this little pond, lake, like a little, I don't even know what it's called, under a waterfall. And we ended up just chatting as we were like swimming across to the other side.
Yeah.
And I was somehow it got into politics and we started talking about Puerto Rico and just like its history. And all of a sudden I was like, this person will be perfect to have on the podcast because I think there's so many things that you were saying that I was like, these things need to be talked about. And so it's a very coincidental meetup, but I'm very glad we met.
Yeah, we there was basically no one around us, so it's very coincidental that we met there.
Yeah.
And yeah, they call that El Charco. So it's just a like accumulation of water through a river flow. So um very interesting that we met there
Yeah.
with basically no one around.
Yeah. Actually, I'm trying to think, is there an English word for that? There definitely is, but I don't know it because it wasn't a lake, it wasn't a pond, it wasn't a river, it wasn't an ocean.
Yeah, I mean, like that was a charco that it's formed by a quebrada, which is kind of like a route to a main river. So yeah, I'm not sure how the English word would be for that.
Yeah.
There might be some. I mean, there
Yeah,
might
there,
be,
there
but
definitely
I
is
don't
some
know it.
like obscure word that's like, yeah, it exists.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, so you live in Indiana now, but you were born in Puerto Rico, correct?
yeah. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico until the age of 17.
Mm.
Came to the United States to study mechanical engineering back in 2017 at the University of South Florida. And in 2021, I moved to Indianapolis for work after I graduated.
Very cool. You miss home often?
Yes, a lot, especially when it's winter up here.
Mm. It never gets too cold here, does it?
I mean, in December, it might get, I mean, in the coast, I might get up to like 80, 85 Fahrenheit. And then the minimum might be like 65, 70
Yeah, it's
an
hot.
average on December. I mean, in the middle of the island, more toward the mountainous range, it could get down to like maybe 35 degrees Fahrenheit, but that's like very early in the morning. Like
Hmm.
throughout the day, it can get up to like 70 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh, but in Indiana it's snowing, huh?
Thankfully, like for being so up north, thankfully it's a very dry winter. Like I think for this winter season, we only had like maybe 4 or 5 snow days.
Hmm.
So not terrible. I mean, I've heard Chicago and New York gets terrible, but still the cold is something to get adapted, especially if you were born and raised in the Caribbean.
One nice thing about traveling in places that have more stable weather patterns is you can just like I've just brought so few clothes because I'm like I don't need a huge jacket. I don't need multiple
Yeah.
jackets. I don't need socks. I just need less clothes to live in a place like this, which
Yeah,
is so helpful.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
I there's a lot to get into today. So perhaps maybe where we can start is, I mean, there's the history aspect. I mean, one of the things I found most fascinating was I've lived in the US for so long, and yet I had barely heard about Puerto Rico outside. This is the first time coming here and speaking to so many people here. I'm like, it's fascinating that it can be a part of the US, yet it can be something that's almost rarely talked about. And so, one of the first questions I asked you when we met was, which is funny that this is the kind of our icebreaker, but I had asked you, I was like, what are people in Puerto Rico's perception of the US? Because I think, and maybe we can start here because one of the hardest things I think I've had is like when I speak about Puerto Rico, do I refer to it as a state? Do I refer to it as a country? Do I refer to it as a territory? How do you refer to Puerto Rico?
So officially, our constitution is defined as a commonwealth. So the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. In Spanish, it has a whole different kind of name. It's called Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, which, if you directly translate to English, is the Free Associated State of Puerto Rico. And this is the constitution that was written in 1952 when the first elected governor kind of negotiated with the United States to kind of define some more autonomy to Puerto Rico. So I personally refer to it as a country. When I was born and raised, like through my first 10 years of living in Puerto Rico, throughout my head, I never considered myself to be somebody from the US. I was raised as a Puerto Rican. Culturally, like personally, I identified as a Puerto Rican. And it wasn't until like I was 12, 13 years, I helped my grandpa in his business. And usually I just like made a couple of errands. One of the errands was to go to the post office to drop a couple things. And on the way, I saw a banner that said Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico. And in my head, I was like, oh, damn, that makes sense. Yeah, we're free because we have our own autonomy. We are associated because, yeah, we kind of have a bilateral relationship with the US. And yeah, we're a state because we're just as like a country. We're a state as a defined as a country. And then once I got to the post office and I saw United States Postal Service, I was like, interesting. Why don't we have our own postal service? So that's when I started like kind of digging more in through history and figuring out like what in reality we are. And right now, to my knowledge and to many people's knowledge, we are still a colony, where it's just hidden as a commonwealth, but in reality, it's just a colony.
Hmm. And so, getting into that, what are some of the things that aren't available to Puerto Rican citizens? Or
Compared to US to
yeah,
somebody from the 50 states. Okay.
yes.
So we define it as a second class citizenship. So there's a little bit of backstory to it. The US invaded us in July 25th, 1898, as part of the Spanish American War. And once that war ended through the Treaty of Paris, Spain kind of ceded us to the US alongside Guam and Philippines. So the US established a military government here. And it wasn't until I think it was 1912, I might be mistaken, but through the Jones Act, it was that US citizenship was granted to anybody born in Puerto Rico. If you look through history, a couple years later, World War I started. So a lot of people say that the reason Puerto Ricans are US citizens nowadays is because the US needed people to fight the US wars through World War I and eventually World War II, Korean War, and etc. So right now, currently, a couple of disadvantages that we have as Puerto Ricans living in the island, because that's a little detail. If you're a Puerto Rican that moves to one of the 50 states of the United States, you're officially kind of a first-class citizen. Like you have all the same rights as someone else living here in the States. But if
Hmm.
you go back to Puerto Rico, you become a second-class citizen. The first thing is we don't vote for the president. Um, Currently, I think in like a couple of weeks, the Democratic Party is going to do a primary down there. So we do vote for the primaries and like kind of select delegates for that. But that's as far as we go and kind of like making a decision for the president of the United States, even though he's our president. Because Puerto Rico has a governor, but in reality, on top of the governor is the president of the United States. We don't have voting representation in Congress. We do have a resident commissioner that represents the 3.2 million people who live in Puerto Rico. She gets a place in commissions in Congress, but she cannot vote in the House floor.
Hmm.
So we do have some sort of autonomy, but in reality, all the decisions are made by the US Congress by people that are not elected by Puerto Ricans.
Hmm.
In Social Security, for example, there was a case that was sent to the Supreme Court a couple of years ago from a citizen from the state of New York. He received supplemental Social Security. And then when he moved to Puerto Rico, they took that out of him because he moved to Puerto Rico and
Oh.
Puerto Ricans are not eligible for supplemental Social Security. Um, we pay Social Security and Medicare to the United States just as another US citizen. However, the amount of like funding that comes to Puerto Rico is disproportionate to those that other states receive. And I mean, there's many, many other things
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I can just keep getting out. And there's a lot of
So
disproportion from between a first class citizen and a Puerto Rican US citizen.
so one question is, what happens if a the way you call that first class citizen moves, who's lived in the 50 states their whole life, moves to Puerto Rico? Are they also revoked?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because for some things we are considered so there was an interesting there was a case back in 1903, I believe, in the Supreme Court that kind of dictated how Puerto Rico was going to be considered for federal affairs. And they called it insular cases. Puerto Rico is an insular case or an insular territory of the United States. So you said we are part of the US, but the way I like to say it is that we belong to the US, but we're not part of. Because if we were part of this kind of disadvantages, this kind of I wouldn't like to say racism, but just disproportionate benefits that we don't have in Puerto Rico wouldn't happen if we were part of the United
Mm,
States.
mm. So who ends up, how are the laws like legislated here? Do they have their own processes to make them?
So we are a Republican, like a Republican form of government. We have a judicial branch, we have a legislative branch, and we have the executive branch. Kind of, it's literally translates to that of a form of a government of one of the 50 states of the United States.
Mm,
We have a governor, we have a Senate, a representatives, House of Representatives, and we have the judicial branch with the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico and the different regional courts. However, back in 2016, yeah, President Obama was president, and Congress was both Senate and the House of Representatives, I think, was controlled by the Republicans. They did a bill called Promesa, Promesa, which in Spanish means promise.
mm,
But it stands for, I don't remember the acronym right now. But what Promesa did was assigns a fiscal board, a fiscal control board to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico was going to default on our debt. We weren't going to be able to pay our debt. I believe it was $70 billion at the time. And the US, to prevent having a territory default for the first time in history, they assigned this fiscal control board of 7 members that are assigned by the President of the United States. Puerto Ricans don't select these people. The President of the United States does this every 3 years. And they go over the executive, legislative, and judicial branch of Puerto Rico. So say that the legislative branch and the executive branch approve a budget for Puerto Rico, the fiscal control board needs to approve it as well. So if the fiscal control board says, no, you're exceeding the amount of money that I am going to permit you to spend this year, we're going to take that part of and we're going to approve the budget our way. So in reality, right now, Puerto Rico is not per se democratic because most of the decisions that our government makes is related to money and how we're going to spend money and what things that we're going to fund, what things we're not going to fund. And now we have 7 people that are not elected by Puerto Ricans. Most of them are not Puerto Ricans making the budgetary decisions for Puerto Rico.
mm. Interesting. I'm trying to figure out, that's a huge kind of difference. Because I was thinking earlier what the difference between people who live in DC and people who live in Puerto Rico are. Because a lot of people in
Mhm.
DC also, can't vote for the president. They because it's a territory, it's not a state either. Do people in Puerto Rico pay federal taxes?
Like we pay Social Security tax and Medicare tax. We don't pay federal income tax, but
Okay.
we do pay a sort of state income tax that we pay to the Puerto Rican government.
Yeah.
However, corporations do have to pay, depending on if they qualify or not. They sometimes need to pay federal taxes
Mm,
to the US. Um, but I would say like maybe 90% of people in Puerto Rico are not obligated to pay federal income tax. Just
mm,
because they live in Puerto Rico, they don't like since we're not a state, we're not obligated to do that. Now, if Puerto Rico became the 51st state, then of course people will need to pay federal income tax.
mm. And people have the right to move to the 50 states at any time, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So So I mean, that's an interesting kind of situation because what you said earlier is if you wanted to become a first class citizen, you could move and you have the ability to move. So how many people do a lot of the people you know end up moving, or what percent of people actually move to the 50 states, would you say?
I mean, back in the 50s, a lot of people moved to New York. So now you see a lot of like Puerto Rican bubbles in the US. There's a lot of people in the Bronx. In recent years, people have been moving more to Kissimmee. There's a lot of people in Chicago. I think back in like the 60s, 70s, a lot of people moved to Hawaii to work on the sugarcane industry over there. So it flows a lot. It depends on what's happening in Puerto Rico and what's happening in the States. Because I mean, before I moved to the United States, Hurricane Maria hadn't had happened. Hurricane Maria happened like 3 months after, and like I think it was like 300,000 people moved after Hurricane Maria to Puerto Rico. But then like a couple of years later, there's a big influx of people moving back. So
Hmm.
um, it flows a lot depending on the situation in Puerto Rico and where these people move to in the United States.
Hmm. So people living in on the island, or what are their kind of perceptions of Puerto Rico's relationship with the US? Because I know earlier you had mentioned it really differs based on the age group. I'm really interested to get a little bit into that.
So it has a very historical connotation to it because I mean we were a very oppressed country during the colonial like military governments. Yeah, we Spanish. That Christopher Columbus landed in Puerto Rico in 1493, and we were a Spanish colony from 1493 till 1898. But during the late 1800s, there was a big independence movement in the Americas, and Puerto Rico was part of that independence movement of being independent from Spain and becoming its own republic. In 1868, we had what we call the Grito de Lares, which is it translates to the Lares Scream, which is the biggest revolt that Puerto Rico has had. It was the first time that the Republic of Puerto Rico was declared in the town of Lares. However, the Spanish army forces killed all those people a couple days later. So in 1898, Spanish American War, we transitioned to the U.S. Colonial rule. And during the US colonial rule, those first 50 years, there was a big oppression from the US government against Puerto Ricans that believed in the independence movement, to the point of referencing to those people as terrorists. There was a gag law in place where you couldn't expose the Puerto Rican flag in public because that was considered a terrorist attack against the United States. So a lot of people were persecuted by the FBI. They were incarcerated because of their political beliefs and their beliefs of Puerto Rico becoming its own republic. So a lot of people got scared. They feared for their lives. They feared for their families' lives because they were being persecuted by the U.S. military government. So a lot of people stopped believing or just publicly of trying to fight for Puerto Rico to become independent. So you see a lot in my grandfather's and my great grandfather's generation. Then when you mention the word independence or the word republic, they've been brainwashed in a sense that that means that we're going to be poor. Puerto Rico's not going to be able to come back from where we are right now, and we're just going to be a very poor republic because of that brainwashing mindset that people were being persecuted. Without the U.S., we won't be able to survive, and because of that, I think we are where we are because Puerto Rico is a very old population. I'm not sure how the demographics work right now, but the people that are leaving Puerto Rico are mostly the younger generations that come to the US, find a job,
Mm,
make savings, and probably in their 40s move back to Puerto Rico. Um, so I would say because of all that historical context, most like I would say 50 to 90 years old people, there's a big discrepancy on what they believe versus what younger generations believe.
mm,
Um, those 50 to 90 years old of people, they believe in the current state that we have, so the Estado Libre Asociado, or some of them also believe that Puerto Rico should become the 51st state. Now, if you go a little bit more to younger generations where they've been exposed to internet, they've been exposed to more history classes, they've been exposed to globalization and being able to see that other republics are also successful in their own ways, then there's been a slight movement of younger people believing in Puerto Rico should become a sense of a republic, or independent nation. Not necessarily a fully independent nation because hey, the U.S. is already in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of U.S. corporations. The U.S. dollar is used throughout every single transaction. So some sort of free associated republic with the United States is what a lot of people believe in. And there's also a lot of people that believe in statehood in younger generations. What I think we younger generations do agree is that the current state that we have is not working and that we need to move to one of the two sides.
Hmm. Is
And it also varies depending on where you are in the island, because metropolitan area, so where you are right now, there's a little bit more people, there's more people, younger people, and also older people that believe more in the independence. But once you go to more the rural areas of the island, more uneducated people, they might just like to stay with where we are or statehood.
hmm. So one thing that I'm really interested about is you talked about the colonialization from the Spanish starting from 1493, which one, for some reason, I didn't know that Columbus landed in Puerto Rico, which is really cool.
Mhm.
Was that his first trip? His first trip, he landed in Puerto Rico?
I believe it was the second voyage, if I'm
Oh,
not
okay, cool.
mistaken. Yeah,
Okay. And so what was
at least that's
the,
what history says.
yeah, what was so is there still a lot of like prevalence of the indigenous kind of culture?
Mm, in our language, yes. There's a couple of words that we use that we gained from the Taínos. The Taínos were the indigenous tribe that lived in Puerto Rico when Christopher Columbus landed. Um, More than that, it's very, I mean, I'll backtrack on that. So first of all, we refer to ourselves not as Puerto Ricans, but as Boricua. And the
Mm.
reason we call ourselves Boricua is because the Taínos called the island of Puerto Rico Borican. So they
Oh.
derive Boricua from that. Um, yes, language, we do have a couple words from the indigenous, the Taínos. But most of those people, unfortunately, were killed during the Spanish colonial times. And then they brought a lot of slaves from Africa. So there was like a big mix between Spain, Taino culture, and African culture. I do know that there's a couple of people more in the rural central area of Puerto Rico that are trying to conserve our heritage from the Tainos. And there's a couple museums, there's a couple of entities that are working and preserving the things that we have left from them. Um, but in the vast majority, unfortunately, the Spanish made sure to like liquidate and get rid of that in our culture.
Mm. So one question I had for you is I learned a little bit more about Hurricane Maria being here, which was in 2017. Is that correct?
September 20, 2017. Yeah.
And I mean, it seems, I mean, I met so many people who said, they've lost large amounts of their house, they've lost their cars. What was what was the impact of that for you personally, and then more generally for Puerto Rico as a whole?
So I was in the States already studying my first semester of college. Hurricane Irma had happened 2 weeks before Maria in Puerto Rico, and a week after it was heading towards Florida. So I was in I was in my dorm still, but it was in a state of more of a shelter. And a week later it was Maria, so it was a rough 2 weeks for me. Being able to get adapted to school and a new country, new language, new people, away from my family. Suddenly there's a hurricane in Puerto Rico. There's the hurricane's coming to Florida, and then a week later, Hurricane Maria happened in Puerto Rico. Um, I still get it affected me a lot even though I didn't live through it because I was over here for 7 days without knowing of my family. And I've gone to therapy to try to work with this, but I still get emotional talking about Hurricane Maria, and it's something that I have accepted that I'm gonna have to live with. Like it was impactful in my life, and it's just part of me now. Uh, so yeah, I spent 7 days without knowing of nobody from my family because the communications were down in Puerto Rico, and my family is from the northwestern part of Puerto Rico. So kind of still very rural. I know San Juan didn't lose as much telecommunications as other parts of the island, or they got it a couple days after the hurricane. But my family didn't get access to telecommunications until 7 days later. Um, They were okay, fortunately, because they went to my grandparents' house during the phenomenon. But my house was affected with the hurricane. Part of the roof came out because of the hurricane, and there was no raw material to be able to fix the house. So those first 3 months after Hurricane Maria, it was a big uncertainty for me. I mean, I was in school for a semester, but at the same time my parents didn't have good telecommunications, so I had to like be able to talk to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to be able to put their case through, to be able to tell them, hey, this is what happened to the house. My family is staying with my grandparents, and walking through all those federal, they gave a
Bureaucracies.
couple of, yeah, federal bureaucracies, and be able to get the help that we needed. But I mean, there was
Mm,
3.2 million other people doing the same thing in Puerto Rico. So at the end of the day, there was no raw materials, and my mom was freaking out because my sister was not in school for 3 months, and they decided to move to the US. They moved close to where I was going to school in Tampa, Florida. And it wasn't until a year after the hurricane that we were able to fix our house. And to this day, there's still things that we're working through because my parents moved to Florida. It's not, you cannot fix a house while being in another place. So we depended a lot on my grandparents or other family members to like be aware of the contractors in the house and trying to fix all of that. At the end of the day, I think it was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that kind of helped putting the roof to my house. But unfortunately, there was a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of corruption with that because most of the funds were managed by the Puerto Rico government. So yeah, definitely impactful in my life, impactful for Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the island and also in the diaspora and outside of Puerto Rico. And I believe it was one of the most costly and deadliest hurricanes in the U.S. history. And unfortunately, at the time, Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and when he went to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, he basically made it seem like nothing had happened there because the Puerto Rico government was complicit. Like they took him to the most rich parts of the Puerto Rico. They took him to where people were able to get out of the aftermath of the Hurricane Maria. So we suffer a lot of discrimination from the federal government. I wouldn't say maybe a little bit of racism, who knows? But that same time, Irma had hit Florida, Harvey had hit Texas. They received a bunch of federal funds, but Puerto Rico, because we're a U.S. territory, we were treated like, well, you guys are second-class citizens. We'll get to you later.
hmm I'm trying to remember if. Thank you for sharing, by the way. I
Yeah,
appreciate. Yeah,
man.
it's hard. It's hard. I mean, I think um, living in California, it's natural disasters is something that I feel like I just never. We always were talked about. We always talked about kind of the potential of having a big earthquake, but I feel like in terms of I mean, I didn't really even know what a hurricane was until I kind of came and I learned a little bit more here.
Yeah.
But it's it can be really painful because a lot of people were showing me how like the roads were completely destroyed. Everything was just it was tough. And so, did you see the island kind of come together? Did you see everybody here kind of come together and collaborate as they built it back up?
Yes, the people, not the government. The
Mm,
people formed community, formed like in their houses. They made a big cafeteria, and people from the neighborhood came and ate in one same house because that
mm,
house may have electricity or that house might have natural gas to be able to cook the food. Um, but yeah, they had to do that because there was no food on the supermarkets. You just relied on the plantain that might have fell in your backyard after the aftermath of Maria, or the small little help that came from the federal government through the army or the National Guard. Uh, but people had to take down the trees, put them aside, be able to restore the access to roads, help people out with their electricity connections, with their water connections, being able to bring potable water to other people, taking people to their medical appointments. Because I mean, that's another thing. That's why the Hurricane Maria was so deadly. It was the slow response from both the state and the federal government that 4,000 people died after Hurricane Maria. I mean, you
Mm,
had people with dialysis, people with cancer, people with other underlying health conditions that needed to get treatment. And unfortunately, there was no electricity, there was no access on the roads, the hospitals were down. So it just, yes, Maria was a Category 5 hurricane, but in reality, the government was not prepared for a hurricane Category 5 for the
mm,
aftermath of that.
mm. Yeah, I mean, people were telling me that they had rebuilt in close to a year, and that was yeah, that can be like I'm curious how that process was. Did you come back during that period of time, the rebuilding period?
I came so December 2017, and I found a whole different country. Coming to my house and seeing it the way it was very tough for me. But I mean, uh, I think I had been able to process it through pictures and all that stuff. And what I was grateful for was that my family at least had my grandparents to be able to take care of them, have a
Mm,
house. But even when you landed in Puerto Rico, you could still see like the blue, they call it the blue roofs, but it's just like a tarp, I think is what it's called in English. Um, Blue tarps on top of the roofs of houses that had their roofs taken out because of the hurricane.
mm,
And that lasted for maybe 2.5 years. I mean, yeah, some people were able to get things done in a year, but some other people weren't able to get access to that until 1, 2, or 3 years later.
mm. I mean, yeah, it's interesting because I wanted to talk to you about this because I feel like the reason I really felt compelled to even have this season and kind of get more into Puerto Rico is like being in San Juan for the little bit that I was. It was interesting to see all these tourists who were just so kind of unaware of a lot of the challenges that people here may be
Hmm.
having. I mean, I think it's the classic trope of an American tourist where you just, kind of oblivious to all the suffering that could
Yeah,
exist. Even I had a friend who went to Jamaica who told me that he was like, people don't really leave the resorts because the second they leave the resorts, they see like some of the
the
other
real
harder
thing.
conditions. Yeah, they see
Hmm.
the harder conditions. So it's like easier to just stay in the resorts and be like, I'm having such a great time. But there's something, it feels so like cruel about that. It's not like a knowing cruelness, but there's something just so cruel about that. What but I do know tourism is also a huge industry in Puerto Rico. So, what are some of your thoughts, and what are some of the more general thoughts that you've seen and heard about tourism?
I am 100% pro tourism. Like, I am not against having other people be able to explore different cultures, different countries, and live through them by staying in Puerto Rico. I just think the government has been accomplice in bringing I mean, the tourist part is okay because most of the people that come in, they go visit the national forest, they go to the beach, they come in cruises, so they live the same day. But the real issue that's happening right now in Puerto Rico is the gentrification through Airbnbs. Um,
Mm,
a lot of people, I mean, after the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, a lot of people lost their jobs, lost their income because of the hurricane because they closed their business or whatever. And they saw that tourism was the way to go. Just go, let's go ahead and fix our house. Let's close down our garage and we can make that an Airbnb. And a lot of people started doing that. And a lot of US investors, foreign investors came into Puerto Rico and started buying property that was damaged by Hurricane Maria, that was abandoned by people that might have left after the hurricane. So especially in the San Juan area, more specifically Old San Juan area, uh, you see these investors coming in buying 20, 30, 40, 50 pieces of buildings and converting them to Airbnbs. There was even one that bought an abandoned school that the government had closed like a year before to take advantage of that. And also because the Puerto Rico government has Act 22, which basically says that if you're a foreign investor, you don't have to pay you don't have to pay income tax in Puerto Rico for a couple of years. So that's why we have Logan Paul now in Puerto Rico because you don't have to pay income tax over
oh, he
there.
lives in Puerto Rico.
Um, he lives in
Uh,
Dorado, Puerto Rico. Yeah,
uh,
yeah, um, yeah. So he just reports his cryptocurrency earnings in Puerto Rico. He doesn't need to pay federal income tax. He doesn't have to pay
uh,
state income tax, and he lives
but he
in paradise.
but he can still vote because he is. Or how does that work?
I mean, there's loopholes to everything.
Mm,
Yeah, maybe his residency is here, but maybe he has a residency still in California, and he goes to boats over there. I mean, I'm sure, I'm not sure if he's very involved politically, but I mean, money wise, that's what many people from the US are doing right now, buying
Mm,
properties, declaring zero income tax, both federally and in the state. And I think the IRS is trying to track them down and kind of declare this unconstitutional. But the thing is, there's like a loophole. There's a loophole because Puerto Rico is not considered a state for tax
mm,
purposes. So, I mean, they might contradict themselves in the process. But going back to tourism, I mean, this big hike in a lot the amount of Airbnbs in Puerto Rico has displaced people out of their probably 20, 30-year homes because the landlord decided I'm going to convert this in an Airbnb. So that's why San Juan, Puerto Rico, right now is the one of the top 10 most expensive cities to live in the whole nation, just because people don't have accessible rent to be able to have a roof under above them. Um, so I think the government has to regulate that somehow. I mean, I know this is an issue that has happened in other Latin American countries like Colombia and Mexico. But unfortunately, the Puerto Rico government is not going to do that because they're seeing a bunch of money coming in through the tourism tax. And in reality, the government just paints a pretty picture for tourists and the local people. Well, good luck.
yeah. It's that seems, I mean, I was in Hawaii during the, peak pandemic when
Hmm.
there was no tourists there, and so it was just I had the opportunity to speak with a lot of local people, and it's interesting. I think a lot of people feel that same way, where it's like tourism is an amazing and beautiful thing, and it stimulates the economy so much for a lot of places, but it can also be, and I think your point of gentrification through Airbnb is one that I haven't heard before, but it's a really interesting thing because it can and does happen, and I'm contributing to that as well as a Airbnb through the country. But like I mean, I think like that's a really interesting kind of. I think we need to develop because the amount of tourism that's been happening as of late is way more than it's ever been in the past. So
Yeah.
like to think of what ethical traveling looks like is going to be something that I feel like is something that needs to be talked about more often now
Yeah.
because yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I've seen some terrible tourists in India, and it can be so. I'm gonna stay in this luxury hotel while right next to me, there's these. It just I don't know how your soul has to somehow kind of justify that to make it okay, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, Puerto Rico's been receiving record numbers of tourists, and I mean that's a great thing. I mean, I love seeing new airline routes going into Puerto Rico because I mean other people get to experience my culture and my country,
Mm,
but it needs to be regulated somehow. And I mean
mm.
it's a tough job, but it has to be done to be able to um, have locals be able to stay in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and have the benefits kind of distribute out to everybody rather than
Yeah.
just a few.
And that's the
So
other thing. The government is relying only on tourism. So slowly, other businesses, other parts of the economy are going to continue transitioning to tourism. And then a natural
mm,
phenomenon like Maria may happen again, and suddenly, well,
no
we don't, our
tourism.
economy stops because there's no tourism.
Yeah.
So it's also a little bit of let's balance our economy with other parts, with other sectors and other industries too.
Mm. So, transitioning into education, which I'm really excited to talk about. One thing I'm curious about to even start with is were your schools and your schooling, was it done in Spanish or was it done in English?
So pre-kinder through eighth grade, I was fortunate enough that my parents paid for a private bilingual school. Keep in mind, private bilingual school in Puerto Rico, it's much cheaper than private schools in the US. I've seen the prices over here. I'm like, my parents couldn't be able to afford that. My parents were low middle class people. My granddad owned a small business in Puerto Rico, and that's where my parents lived. So I was fortunate enough that my parents made the effort to put me in a bilingual school where I was able to learn English and continue and be a bilingual person. So in those grades, most of my classes were in English, and of course I took Spanish in Spanish. Then in ninth grade, I transitioned to the public school system in Puerto Rico, and all the classes there were done in Spanish, and then English was done in Spanglish.
Mm,
Uh, Unfortunately, the English curriculum in public schools is not great. The teachers that are teaching it, unfortunately, most of them are not prepared to give English classes, and the government doesn't push for people to learn English. So you might have seen that you might have faced issues trying to speak English in other parts of the island. San Juan is pretty good. Most people are bilingual, or at least can talk a little bit of Spanglish. But maybe if you go more to the rural part of Puerto Rico or the west part, you might struggle a little bit more because Puerto Ricans are not 100% fluent in English because of the public system. Most of my friends in the public system of education, they learn English through watching series, listening to music, watching YouTube videos, and like kind of pushing themselves to be able to speak the language.
Mm. So, in a lot of cultures that I've spoken to that have this kind of dynamic where there's this transition of their cultural language into English, especially, there it becomes like a cultural thing as well. It becomes like a sign of, for some people, a sign of prestige, or it becomes does that kind of balance also exist here, where
Yeah.
speaking English is kind of like a looked at as like a more superior kind of thing?
Yeah, because we look up to the US.
Mm,
The end goal of Puerto Ricans, like the way at least they brainwash you since you're being raised, is that the opportunities are over here in the States. That for you to be
mm.
able to be successful in life, you need to leave Puerto Rico and you need to come to the States and work and study over here. So society itself kind of pushes you also away from Puerto Rico, and that you need to learn English to be able to be in the States. Keep in mind, many of the people that come from Puerto Rico to the US are not prepared in English. So those are the same people that in a couple of years also go back to Puerto Rico because they struggle. I mean, if you don't move to Kissimmee, Florida, Miami, Florida, or even New York, if you move to Iowa, Nebraska, you're gonna have a hard time being able to find native Spanish
Mm.
speakers. So most of those people just go back to Puerto Rico.
So you had some friends who also moved. Did they have a similar educational background to you? Did they have a harder time transitioning to speaking English all the time, or no?
So I'm trying to remember myself. I think I only have like two or three friends that moved over here. But I do have a lot of family members that moved over here.
Mm.
My family members, they don't speak much English. They've had to have learned a lot of English to be able to stay over here. One of my
Mm.
cousins, she serves in the Navy right now. And I mean, she's been able to get by with the broken English that she had. And I've talked to her in English a couple times when I've seen her over here, and I've seen the progress in her. The other cousin that I have over here, I mean, I think she doesn't speak too well English. I know her husband does. And then my two friends that I have over here, they're doing their PhD. So yeah, they speak pretty good English to be able to do their studies.
Cool. Nice. Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge because I think it's a challenge that many people have. I think even my parents, where they had spoken Tamil almost their entire life, having to transition and pick up a new language and be able to communicate in corporate and, in all
Hmm.
these different in sections.
Yeah.
So have you seen attempts? Because if the goal, in some ways, if the Puerto Rican dream that's presented is to leave, are there attempts from the schools and the government to incorporate English more and more into the curriculum?
No. I
Why
mean,
is
I
that?
think because if you have a poor educational system, then that means you're going to have uneducated people voting for you. And you're going to be able to manipulate the public opinion of those people and be able to have those people vote for you out their false promises.
Hmm.
So right now, when the Fiscal Control Board came into action in 2017, they closed down like a third of schools in Puerto Rico. And ever since that, they've closed more and more and more schools. So now people that had accessible schools 5 minutes from their house, now they need to take a public bus to be able to get to their next nearby school, which is 40 minutes away. So yeah, they're not improving the curriculum, but they're also making education inaccessible.
Hmm. One question I have for you is, when deciding like where to go for college, for example, what were some of the did you have a lot of access to that type of information, or how did you make that decision?
So I was not planning on moving to the US to go to school. All my life, I said that I was gonna go to the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. That's like the top school in Puerto Rico for engineering. And that was always my end goal after I graduated from high school. I was gonna go to El Colegio de Mayagüez. That's how we call it in Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, when I was about to graduate, there was a lot of strikes, and the educational system, the upper educational system, so the University of Puerto Rico, shut down for 3 months. And thankfully I had taken the SAT because I had done great in my standardized test in Puerto Rico, so I decided to take the SAT just to see how I did. And the University of South Florida reached out to me and told me and kind of offered me basically almost a all-inclusive scholarship to be able to go study in Tampa.
Nice.
So in March of 2017 is when I made the decision that I was going to move to Florida to be able to pursue my degree over there. Keep in mind also engineering being in Puerto Rico 5 to 6 year program. In the US, it was just a 4 year program.
Mm,
So I took advantage of that, and I do not regret taking that decision. Being able to experience different cultures, a different country, and I really liked my experience at USF. But in reality, when I was making all those decisions, I was just relying on Google. Unfortunately, it's not the social worker, the school counselor. She was dealing with 800, 900 other students in the school, and it was only her. So I didn't expect her to be able to help me individually. But unfortunately, the government and the school itself didn't give her the tools to be able to give a little bit more general guidance to everyone to be able to pursue their postgraduate degrees. Uh, Thankfully, I did have a couple of universities coming into Puerto Rico, and keep in mind, a lot of Puerto Ricans, um, they go more to technical vocational schools instead of like more academia schools,
mm,
because it's what you take a 1 or 2 year technical program and then you're out working and you're being able to get that income pretty quickly, which people need because most of Puerto Ricans live under the poverty line.
mm. Have you been to the US before then, or the 50 states?
No, that was so when I came to visit USF, that was my first time on a plane.
Mm.
I had exited Puerto Rico through cruises, so cruises through other Caribbean islands. But in March 2017 is when I took my first plane and came to the US.
What was your first thought when you landed?
Um, I I mean, I was very excited. I was getting on an airplane. I've always wanted to be on an airplane. Unfortunately, I hadn't been able to do that until I was 17. But when I landed in Tampa, I mean, it it was different. I mean, the roads were nice. I saw bigger skyscrapers. Um, I saw fast food chains that were not in Puerto Rico, but I did see on ads through the different channels that I saw when I was a kid. So I mean, it was I was discovering things that I had never seen, so I was kind of excited for that. But when I went to USF, I was like, wow, this is a beautiful campus. The
Mm,
buildings are taken care of. Like there's funding going into this, and people are not actually stealing this money is destined to education. So that's when I finally just made the decision of, hey, I am basically being paid to be here, so I'm just gonna take this
yeah,
leap of faith and did it.
that's amazing to hear. I'm really happy you were able to kind of create that opportunity for yourself. Yeah, I mean, a full paid
Yeah.
scholarships is lovely.
It is. Especially, I worked in the cashier's office in the US and seeing people taking student loans. I was like, okay, wow, this is crazy.
Yeah,
Because there was no way I could have afforded a US university education
super
with my parents'
expensive.
income.
Yes,
Yeah, no,
it's
it's super
so
expensive.
expensive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a question I always love asking people who've, been brought up in different cultures, but it's always interesting to get people's perspective on this question. But what would you say, in your experience, culturally, not just like things that we necessarily do or traditions, but more like the way we think or the way we kind of philosophize about the world? What are some of the biggest differences you've noticed between Puerto Rican philosophy or how people live their lives and in the US?
People in the US are very individualistic. They're always doing their own thing and they don't care much about their community or people around them. Uh, people whine a lot.
Mm,
Uh, in Puerto Rico, we had very tough conditions to live in, so we kind of had to make amends with what we had. So we kind of just survived with what the small amount of resources that we had. But I've seen so many people here that are fortunate to have like parents with great income, a great house, and a great school, and they just whine by like very small little things, and it's just kind of like um, it kind of it makes me think that people are not appreciative of what they have. Um, and yeah, that came with a big shock to me coming from where I came from. Something very funny is that when the electricity goes off here in the States, people are like, "Whoa, what is this?" They start going crazy. They're like, "Oh, I don't have internet, all that stuff." I'm like, "Dude, I have to do homework with capitals sometimes," and that was just normal for me. Or I didn't have water, so I just have to wait a couple hours to see if some pressure comes in and I can get a shower. So um, I was raised in with sometimes a lack of resources, not because my parents wanted to, it's just because how the government distributes basic resources like electricity and water. Um, I think those are most like the main things that I can think of. And I mean, I this is a topic that I discussed with my girlfriend. My girlfriend's from Venezuela, so she kind of was raised in a similar situation as what I was raised. Um, I do have a couple more, but I can't think of it right now.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think what you bring up is one of the most common realizations or people's observation after being in the US, which is because we have a lot more of like the infrastructure, we can rely on our infrastructure, whether it's our access to water or electricity, our kind of anytime any of those things even slightly become, unstable, it's like all things break loose. And I
Yeah.
think about that all the time of just like in my day to day, I almost interact with zero animals. And if I do interact with one, it's probably somebody's dog. But it's like that's why even being here in Puerto Rico, I sometimes feel like I'm back in India in a lot of ways because it's like nice to sometimes see chicken and roosters just, one time we had a huge iguana blocking our way to like leave the little space that we were staying in. And I was like, I've never seen an iguana that big, but it's nice and also challenging in some ways to like have animals reintroduced to your life, like just like have nature also be in your face rather than just like
Yeah,
pushed off to, okay, I want to spend the weekend in the forest, and then only do you experience kind of the
right.
randomness of what it can throw at you. So it's been nice to experience that, which gets me to my next and almost last question of what are some of the things that you love about Puerto Rico that maybe people who
Uh,
just come for a week may not be able to like see or understand.
I mean, first, the culture. We've been a very persistent culture, even with the attempts of the Spanish and American government to kind of assimilate us to one or the other. We've been resilient to be able to have a very unique culture. And that's something that I like to share with the world. Like, we are different. We are not Americans, as most people call us. We are Puerto Ricans. So I like to share that. And music, I mean, you don't know the amount of times that I go to Puerto Rico and just by hearing the coquí sound, that brings me a lot of nostalgia. Because that's something that I heard every night in my house. Seeing people perform arts in like random public spaces, perform music with instruments and all that stuff. That's something that I miss very, very deeply. The beaches, of course. I mean, I lived in the mountains, but I was 30 minutes away from the beach. And even though I didn't go bathe myself in the beach, and something in the car, just walking, I was close enough to the beach to experience the ocean, experience sunsets, experience the fauna of the maritime fauna that can be found there. The people, I've as I moved to the US, I've experienced, of course, different cultures, and I have a more globalized mind, and I have been able to identify things that I don't want to replicate from Puerto Ricans, but I still think that we are a very special set of beings, and I love to say that I'm Puerto Rican to everyone around me because um, we are very special people, and I miss the people back home. Eh, the food. Earlier we were talking about the food. Yeah, I'm not a fan of fried food, but sometimes I want a mofongo. And unfortunately here in Indianapolis, I cannot find a mofongo. I need to do it myself. or I cannot find tostones as a side when I go out to eat. So I need to do that myself. Um, that's something that I struggled coming to the US with food. I mean, even though we import most of the food in Puerto Rico, being able to go to my grandma's house and she had like fresh food from her garden, it's just kind of like, I miss that.
Mm.
The weather for sure. Yeah, I know it's hot over there down there, but I prefer to sweat than being freezing cold over here. I prefer to be able to wear shorts and tank tops and just I'll deal with it than the cold over here.
Mm.
Uh, so yeah, I mean those are the main things that I miss. Being able to get coffee, like good coffee, basically anywhere. Over here, I also need to be nitty picky with the coffee that I drink, and I still don't find like the one that I like. So
Mm. It's a lovely island, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely place. I really enjoy being here. I mean, the people have been very kind. The weather has been kind to me. I really like the weather. The mosquitoes, not so much, but everything else, yes.
they're never kind.
Yeah, the mosquitoes are brutal. But, I guess one thing, the last question I have for you is, typically when people come here to travel, they go to San Juan, or
Mhm.
maybe Ponce. But what are some of the more hidden gems that you've kind of come across in your life that you would maybe recommend?
I love Cabo Rojo, which is on the southwestern part of Puerto Rico.
Mm,
Great beaches, hidden gems like a natural bridge. There's a lighthouse on there, good food. There's a nice area called Boquerón with good restaurants. And just the topography of the south side of Puerto Rico is very different from the topography on the north side of the island. So that's a town that I enjoy a lot. And honestly, if I were to go back, that's one of the towns I would consider moving back to. The center of the island has a lot of hidden gems that I haven't been able to explore myself, even
mm,
though I lived there 17 years. But Utuado, Puerto Rico, in the center of the island is amazing. Has good rivers, has good restaurants, and that's where you would find a lot of indigenous, like museums, indigenous culture still standing there. Orocovis, which is we call it the heart of Puerto Rico. It has the biggest zip line in the Americas, so
mm.
definitely something that people should check out. Um, and I think, fortunately enough, with TikTok and all that stuff, what were hidden towns or hidden gems 2 or 3 years ago. There's a lot. It's been receiving a lot of tourists, and that's something that I noticed in this past trip that I had in March over there. That I went to Aguadilla, I went to Cabo Rojo, and I saw a lot more influx of tourists in those areas. So I
Mm,
think Puerto Rico slowly but steady has been getting a little bit more like people that go to Puerto Rico, they slowly and steady get out of Port of San Juan and visit other places. And a couple of years ago, people just stay in San Juan.
mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate you for getting on the podcast, and I'm really excited to kind of this is the introduction of this season, and so I feel like your covering of the history and we getting into like people's perception, because I think sometimes I speak to a lot of professors, but I think they can often be like disconnected from what just
Hmm.
just people in general
Yeah,
outside of the like outside of the university think. And so I think I'm really glad I was able to speak to you and kind of get your sense of what are people feeling.
of course. Glad to educate people around me and being able to not expose, but make more vivid the experience of Puerto Ricans.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me here.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.